Hello, and thank you everyone for joining us for a discussion on scaling sustainably from seed to IPO. This is a lead dev webinar created in partnership with Lohika. This webinar will last roughly 45 minutes, after which both myself and the panelists will head over to the lead dev Slack channel to answer some of your questions in the scaling channel. We may have time to answer a couple of questions live, so please do submit those through the Q&A and we might try to get to them. Okay, let's start with some introductions. My name is Christian McCarrick. I'll be the moderator for the panel today, and I'm currently an engineering leader at Facebook and have been the VP of engineering of multiple startups. I'm also the host of the Simple Leadership podcast. Today, I'll be joined by a few other amazing and awesome engineering leaders. First off, we have Shama. Welcome, Shah. Shah is currently Vice President and Head of Engineering at Catalyst.io, an industry-leading customer success platform. Prior to Catalyst, she was the VP of Engineering at GitHub, where she was responsible for core platform and ecosystem. In 2017, as VP of Engineering at SendGrid, she was part of the leadership team that took the company public. Now, Pooja Brown.
Hello.
Good morning. Pooja leads the engineering teams at Stitchflix, responsible for powering the core systems that deliver personalized fixes of apparel and accessories for men, women, and kids. Prior to Stitchflix, Pooja led engineering teams at DocuSign, building web, mobile, and API solutions for their e-signature project. Emelia Reynolds.
Hi, everyone.
Emelia is the head of engineering at Superhuman, where she is focused on scaling the engineering team. She joined Superhuman in 2016 to build the mobile team and also manage the customer delight team, becoming an integral member of the company leadership. Emelia is one of the first iOS developers in the world, having joined Apple after graduating from Brown in 2006. And you can't see it, but she's got an awesome drum kit behind her and a guitar, and I've been staring at that, and we're going to jam after this. So stay tuned for that. Okay. Also, Brad Taylor.
Hello.
Brad is the Senior Director of Engineering at Marqeta. Brad is a hands-on, mission-driven engineering leader who has led teams across a variety of industries, including healthcare, accessibility, gaming, men's fashions, pets, power tools, and payments. Prior to serving as Senior Director of Engineering at Marqeta, he helped bring Shaper, the world's first computer-guided handheld power tool, and Whistle, a health and location tracking wearable for dogs and cats, to market. Everyone's full bio and their social links can be found on this session's event page at the lead dev. All right, let's get started with today's panel. What does it mean to scale an organization? What works for a 10-person startup is not going to work for a 100-person or even a 1,000-person company about to go IPO. Although every company and situation is different, there tend to be a remarkable number of similar patterns that appear at each stage of growth. Each of our panelists have experienced these different phases of growth at multiple companies. During our discussion today, we will hear about the lessons learned and how they each have navigated through scaling their organizations. A lot of people ask, what's the difference between growth and scaling? One of the key definitions I found on the internet was the difference is with growth and scale is that scale is achieved by increasing revenue without increasing significant costs. You cannot grow your resources linearly with your output. It's something that your VCs will be watching as you try to raise later funding rounds. All right, let's start with some of the first questions. Let's start early stage and small. The role of an engineering lead is very different from a Series A company to a later stage company. Emelia, how would you define the role of a head of engineering at an early stage startup? Let's say maybe Series A or B.
Yeah, I think at early stage companies, the head of engineering wears many, many hats, and the role changes very frequently. As the team scales, as the company scales, this might be 5, 10, 15, 20, 50, 100, and so on for your engineering organization. The role is a little bit different at each of those stages. I think one of the things that's incredibly important in that role is to really define engineering philosophies early on and have sort of a backbone to be able to, in a framework to sort of, transition between each of those stages. I think, another part of that role is really making sure that you find the right balance between helping the team move very quickly and also introducing process that's kind of warranted at each kind of size of the team. I know at Superhuman, one of the things that was really important for us was to create a canary process for our builds. That's just kind of an example. Early on, we were moving really quickly. We, didn't want anything kind of getting in the way of, being able to ship really, really quickly. But then eventually we started running into bugs in production and had to create kind of a process to make sure that we weren't finding those bugs, that our users weren't finding those bugs. So I think that's an example of something a head of engineering could be instrumental with, is like finding that right balance between making sure the team can move quickly, but also introducing process.
Awesome. And we'll get into process a little bit deeper later, because that's a topic that comes up again and again as we're trying to scale. Pooja, how would you say that compares to the head of engineering, a VP of engineering at a later stage company, possibly approaching an IPO or post-IPO?
It's interesting, what Emelia said is that it's true, is that always balancing sort of growth and process. Imagine that sort of 10x at a later stage, right? Is that because you're still on the track of product market fit, right? There's still a lot of feature growth that continues to be had, but how do you do that in a way that, as you said, in a scalable fashion, where adding more developers, adding more systems, adding more features, actually you can get without increasing the overall cost structure, right? So things that come to my mind are, you start building, I would say to some extent, maybe centers of excellence, right? So like, instead of having like full stack engineers who can do everything front end, back end, middleware, right? You start breaking out systems in that stack, right? And start investing those horizontally, right? So for example, you might want to have an API solutions team. You actually might want to have a persistent storage team, right? You might want to start thinking about front-end systems different from middleware that actually connects those front-end calls to sort of back-end API calls. Like, those are things that I imagine a VP of engineering at that stage starts thinking to split out. In addition, I would say is that you got to start thinking about SOX pretty early, right? And the reason I bring that up now versus later is because, people use SOX as a hammer, right? Actually, if you look at SOX is actually a really, I think, a very elegant way to create transparency in your processes, right? You can continue to innovate and have a lot of feature growth while relying on technology that creates audit trails or creates quality checks at the right time. So when you when you actually have IPO, or you sort of like IPO readiness, those things don't come across as orthogonal to your SDLC practices.
Awesome, thank you. And for some of our listeners out there who may be at super early stage, you can Google SOX. It's something that is you'll get very familiar with, hopefully, as you grow and scale. Brad, for you, what are some of the most important things you've had to focus on kind of at the early stage in your growth of companies?
Yeah, the early stage, kind of as Pooja said, you're really looking at kind of folks who are very full stack, who want to work across a variety of different technologies in order to get the job done. So you look for folks who are really aligned with the product and the outcome. So ideally, you're getting them really steeped and embedded in the customer. Ideally, they're the customer. And so I've been lucky at Whistle where, I was a customer, and all of our employees, for the most part in the early days, were customers, as in we had pets. And we put trackers on those pets, the beta versions of our trackers. So you became really embedded in the customer, knowing it really, really well. And that was really straightforward for folks to think about the features that would be appropriate for that user, and do it in a way that was as lean as possible. Ultimately, if you don't quite have product market fit yet, it's pretty important to not invest or overinvest in the technology, overbuild, and then end up in a situation where you have to redo a bunch of code to make it fit the market. So a lot of it is kind of being steeped in the customer and making sure you've got the right alignment between product and the business, and engineering to make the right solution, the right lean solution there.
I really like that, the part you mentioned too, especially when your employees are actually kind of quote unquote dog fooding, no pun intended for your pet startup, their product. I think it actually doesn't make sense, especially when you might not have formal product managers and other things early on, where your engineers really have a good sense of what's going to delight the customer in that case. Right, awesome. We talk sometimes about startups, and I think over the years, a lot of people might be romanticizing working at startups, right? Especially if you're at a larger, more established company. Emelia, you worked at Apple for a number of years before pivoting to startups. What's some advice you might give to engineering leaders going from a bigger company, more established, to now kind of working to a smaller startup?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think, there's no one size fits all. So not all startups are the same, and certainly not all big companies are the same. But I think one of the things that can be true for engineering leaders at larger companies is you tend to be more outward facing. It's a very cross-functional role, and there's more organizational challenges in a sense. When you move to a smaller company, you really are going to wear tons and tons of different hats, and you'll have an opportunity to be really focused on the team. One of the things that I think is really important for leaders at small companies and on small teams is to be hands-on, to really embed in the technology and understand the technology to be able to guide the team through technical challenges. I think that can be less true at larger companies. So I think if I'm trying to sort of decide, do I want to be at a larger company? Do I want to be at a smaller company? And think about the trade-off between organizational complexity versus technical complexity.
Cool. Yeah. Anyone else have anything to add on top of that? No. Cool. There's lots of things. I know it's a big change, but everyone kind of goes through and does different things. So I've done both, and there's pros and cons of everything. So I would recommend it's kind of a small, as we talk about here, small world. Talk to your friends that maybe are at smaller companies. If you're a smaller company going to a bigger company, talk to them as well. Kind of find out the culture, see what's going to work for you. Kind of really get that good sense. Okay. I think Emelia touched on this before. Sooner or later, every startup needs to add and formalize some sort of processes. And this is going to continue from the beginning, kind of all the way through, right? You're always kind of looking to adjust, add processes. So Brad, what are some of the most important first processes to add? Emelia talked previously about kind of doing some testing and canary stuff. Anything else specific that you've had to add first?
Yeah, I think that SDLC is a really key component. So trying to make sure you've got a really smooth process for folks to get their code changes out to production, out to test. That's usually something that's pretty easy to set up, right? Modern CI/CD is typically, especially at a startup, a one-click thing. So I'll expand a bit more on that and say, I think the next process really to think about is the engineering ladder and how folks get from the current ladder to where they are and where they want to be in the future. So I think really codifying what it takes to be a senior engineer, a lead engineer, a manager, principal, et cetera, is really important. It also helps us standardize what the hiring process looks like. When we say lead engineer, what does it look like when we go and interview someone out in the market? I think the challenge with in particular, a senior role is different in a lot of different companies. So having a standard approach for what that looks like, both internally and externally, is really critical in that kind of more foundational stage as the team's going from, let's say, 3 to 10 or 10 to 20.
Awesome. So that's a kind of a good segue into, I think, career ladders. It's a tool that I've found invaluable as an engineering leader. And so you mentioned that, Brad, but Shah, at what stage in a company's growth would you consider putting in a formal ladder? Like, what do you think makes sense for that one, Shah?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what, it never hurts to start talking about career growth early on, even when you're just a few people. I think it's especially, in a startup environment where you're going 1,000 miles an hour. A lot of times people want to know, like, hey, it feels like I've been at this company for a really long time, and where is my career going here? And I think a lot of times you're also helping people transition from kind of super early stage where you are the jack of all trade and you lean in everywhere to kind of then making that shift to like, hey, now that we're solving bigger problems at scale and going deeper, we need to start having specialization. And what does that look like? And so I think it's important to think about, do you have a career ladder that represents both a technical growth pattern that's in parallel with a management ladder, so that you have different options, whether people want to kind of switch ladders or if they want to remain technical, that they feel like they have growth opportunities. And I think at some point it's important to think about it in terms of scope and impact. So like at which level should you have what level of impact to the company, to the department, to your team, and things like that. And so, yeah, so I think it never hurts to kind of start having those discussions early. start with a few ladders and expand from there, start from a few levels and expand there if necessary. But I think people should have a good grasp of like, hey, where am I and where am I going from a career perspective, even at an early stage.
Awesome. And you do mention a couple things that are in there important. I think scope and impact. Pooja, anything else that you think should be included as parts of a career ladder?
No, it sort of depends on like where you are in the stage of the company as well, right? So like I think, when you are getting to a place of defining the culture of the company, right? And whatever the culture of the company is, being able to reinforce that as part of the career ladder is an important thing. So I'll give you an example, like for Stitch Fix, like D&I is super critical, right? But however, it is also as important that our career ladders reflect that investment shows, right? So it's easy to sort of like bucket it under impact and influence versus raising it as a priority, as like you as a leader, what are you doing to move this forward? Whether it's in recruiting, whether it's in, outside speaking and being able to provide those signals. So I think that's a company's culture, but I imagine that at every stage, there is something that the group of people have agreed on as a culture, and being able to reflect it in your career ladders is going to ensure that culture is sort of instigated across your entire team.
Excellent point. Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree with that. And you bring up, I think, diversity and inclusion there. Shah, how important is a career ladder also to have something codified and tangible, helping to make sure that everyone at a company is, treated equitable with raises, promotions, salary, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where, at Catalyst today, we're a Series B company, but we've had a head of people starting at a very early stage. And I think that's a role that's, super critical to add at a startup. And a lot of times startups don't think about adding a head of people early enough. And I think to have, someone there to kind of really codify, like he said, kind of the culture, our values, what we believe in, and how to measure that, how to go through a calibration process, how to talk about it, how to go through, unconscious bias training as a team. I think those are all really important things to get right at the beginning, because I think then it becomes more of a multiplying effect, right? Once everyone is, aware of like, hey, here are the things that that we're not catching. Like everyone, we all have our own like unconscious biases, and a lot of times just being aware of them and being able to like talk through them and catch them early, or kind of build that into an interview process, so that, for example, part of our interview process, we do have interviewers training where we talk about like, hey, these are the things that, you should talk about in an interview process. And these are the type of questions to ask, and so I think having those built in from an early stage is also super important as you continue to grow, because then it's not something that you have to, change directions in later down the road, but something that you're just growing as part of your culture and as part of the startup.
Awesome. Yeah, great points. And I think it's a couple other points to point out. As you talked about before, having the dual track, it's interesting. And I think supporting people going back and forth. There's a couple of great posts by Charity Majors. She talks about the pendulum, manager and employee. And I think those are really good to sort of, celebrate someone trying something, but it's not necessarily promotion, and going back and forth, I think is another awesome thing to let people try that experience as well. Okay, kind of moving on there a bit here. Something that I think all engineering leaders need to become familiar with is org design, org growth, and of course, the occasional and often dreaded reorg. I think we've all been through one, we've done them. They can cause a lot of anxiety and stress. But I think, Pooja mentioned this earlier on around specialization versus generalist. Brad, taking that comment, when do you see that shift start happening in companies? Like, is there a number of employees? Is there, what have you seen as a pattern where you kind of start to go for specialized to general, general to specialized?
Yeah, I've seen it happen at big companies like Marqeta, at small companies like Whistle. I think it's happening all the time. And so I think you kind of need to be watching out for it in context switching, looking at engineering velocity. So I'll be honest, about a year ago, I did a relatively large reorg inside of my teams. realized it just from talking to people, looking at engineering velocity, looking at kind of what had been shipped, that we were kind of lagging behind, and started digging in what the issue was. And turns out the biggest issue was context switching. So folks that were working on 2 or 3 or 4 different software projects all at the same time. This is really where that generalist mindset was great when we were a little bit younger, but as a more advanced company, that became a problem. And so we said, okay, well, how do we get everyone one key area of focus to go really deep on and start to specialize in that role? And that was a big exercise for us to do, because we were at that point 300 and something people, right? So big company, big hairy thing. And as you mentioned, reorgs are tough. We also had a situation where there was a lot of reorg fatigue and a little bit of uneasiness for folks on what's going to happen. So I think the key there was really walking through everyone on the decision-making process. Why did we end up in the path that we took? Why did we take these steps, and what did we learn from that process? And then what are the success metrics of this whole reorg? How are we going to judge whether it worked well or not? And I think being able to put that more openly out allowed the focus to change from, something's changing with my job and I'm uneasy about it, to, I understand why the change is happening. I understand how we're going to see it successful, and I'm part of its success.
Yeah, I think good points. That Pooja, anything else to add around what else you might think about when designing an organization for growth? Like, kind of what are the top things you talk about? Brad just mentioned about context switching. Anything else that you try to optimize for?
Yeah, I was raising my hand because I had this burning thought to share, which is like, if you think about, I truly believe in Conway's law, is like your product will look like how your organization is designed. Like, it's just like it more and more, it keeps coming back to me. And as you have like larger teams and larger teams to manage, that starts showing up. Like, that shows up in various tabs, that shows up in, how one team addresses the same problem and a piece of that. So like, what I would also look at when you're thinking about orgs is that, how do you think about, the market or the product that you're operating in this current market, right? And that might actually also inform how to think about the split in your teams. Now, I will be honest, that's not always the right way, because from a system design perspective, that might not always match up. However, but starting from that lens and then thinking about how you can create longevity to systems and ownership is also another piece of information when you're thinking about org design. In my mind, engineers do best when they live with a system or a code base over years, right? And that's not a great thought to hear from a product person, but if you think about like a larger company, I think it's super critical, because then you're thinking about what it takes to nurture the system, it's warts, you buried those bodies yourself, how to clean that up yourself. So it's an interesting math, but I feel those two things need to happen constantly as your business changes.
Yeah. Awesome. Great points. So one of the downsides of growth and think and scaling sometimes is that not everybody can come along for the ride. I think people have sweet spots. An engineer might love being the one of the 10 people in a room, and it becomes miserable for them when they kind of grow and scale. I'll put this out to both either Emelia or Shah. Have you ever had any situations where it just wasn't the right fit for a person anymore, maybe what they wanted to do, what they're passionate about, and you had to kind of have that conversation? Like, how do you find out that person might not be right anymore? And then, what are steps you can do to help with that?
Yeah, I can take a stab at this. I'm a huge believer of kind of the right fit at the right stage. And so the way I think about it is always kind of framing it in terms of kind of a Venn diagram of like 3 circles, in terms of, what are people really good at? Like, kind of what are the talent and skills that they bring to the table? And what areas are they really passionate about, in terms of, this is something that, they care deeply about, and they're willing to put in a lot of hours to kind of just go after something. Because they're excited by it and they're really motivated by it. And then finally, kind of what opportunities do we have available within the company to kind of really help people express themselves from a talent and passion perspective. And so I believe kind of in that intersection of the three circles, right? If you think about a Venn diagram, if you can help optimize somebody's talent, passion, by giving them the right opportunities that really optimizes the other two, I think it leads to really, really great things, both from a personal career development perspective, as well as where your company is trying to accomplish. And I think those are the moments that I try to look for as an engineering leader, is to kind of find those matches. And I'm sure like we've all had those moments in our careers where like, those are the things that comes to mind when you think about what to put on your resume, or, you know, what you talk to your friends about, like, wow, I felt so fulfilling doing this because of these reasons. And so I think it's important to early on, you know, have that understanding as an engineering leader, just kind of across the board, talking to the employees in terms of like, you know, what really drives you, motivates you, and how as a leader can I find those opportunities that really matches both of those areas.
Great. Muya, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I really like that framework for how to think about, you know, the right fit. I think another thing that's important to think about is, you know, while we're all building a product or series of products, you know, we also are building a team, a culture, and a company. And so I think letting, you know, in addition to somebody's, you know, engineering prowess and how that fits in with the particular stage, thinking about how the person's contributions outside of engineering to the culture and to the team, how they impact the overall team, is something to factor in. That's another thing that I like to think quite a lot about. You know, being in a situation where it isn't necessarily the right fit, I think can be quite challenging. But just making sure you're drawing upon a wide spectrum of what fit means, I think is incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. And that segues, I think, nicely into something where people always talk about the importance of scaling culture, and really what does that mean and how you do it. And, you know, sometimes I don't always think they mean what they really say. But, you know, Pooja, for you, if you were to think about, you know, scaling culture, what are some of the important things that means to you? Like, how would you go about doing that? What are the things to focus on?
Yeah, you know, there are two aspects of it. Is like, one is sort of recognizing that whether you are a culture fit company or a culture add company, right? I think like those are two actually different things, and at different stages of the size of the company, you can be at different places, right? Is that I've been in small startups where there's the culture fit, like there's a culture fit test, right? Which to some extent means that you're most likely going to get people that are similar to you, right? And like that could be whatever that is, right? That could be folks who can work for 24 hours because that's what that company needs at that stage, right? It's like, you know, so there's a question around I have is like culture fit and culture add. And when I think about culture add, is like culture add means that you are being open for some other views to have a point at the table or a seat at the table, right? And then you're open to evolve your culture based on that new addition. So, you know, when you think about like big companies, when you think about boards and diverse boards, like it's actually is because you're trying to get a culture add, you're trying to get an outside perspective. So, you know, really thinking about those two vectors, and that might be the right thing for, you know, for you at a different time, at a different stage of a company. And I would say, like, in addition to that, is like when you say scaling culture, you know, it's processes and traditions that define culture, right? So like you really understanding what that means, right? Like, for example, like I've been, you know, there's a culture at Stitch Fix, which is like my clearings, right? And then clearing is essentially like you walk into a meeting and recognizing that you are a human. You might have had, I don't know, a difficult morning, you had a cranky kid, you had, you know, you were dealing with things, and being able to make space for that at the beginning of a meeting is a cultural practice, right? And that could define the culture. That's a tradition, it's a norm, but that defines the culture of the company that says, hey, I accept your authentic self. I accept your whole self. And now we understand that was your morning. You can be clear and present now, and that's out of your mind. So those are things I would look at as traditions and sort of beliefs that scale with your culture.
Excellent. Anyone else? Shah, Brad, want to kind of add on to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of things I think about. I think from a culture perspective, it should be, your North Star in terms of how you think about calibration, how you think about kind of the behaviors that you do want to encourage. So for example, I think, being customer focused, right? Having that be top of mind. And so whether it's in engineering, whether it's in customer success, whether it's in sales, that's a conversation you can have during performance review time, during just kind of normal day to day, like, hey, what does putting customers first mean from an engineering perspective, right? And so maybe that means caring about the metrics that have true customer impacts and not over optimizing on technical debt or over optimizing on over architecture, right? And what does that mean from a sales perspective? So I think having some of those guiding principles is good. I think where organizations fail is that you have a lot of published, here are our mission, vision statement, culture, values, and things like that. And nobody ever remembers them, right? There are standard boiler template things that you just read everywhere. I think, so it's useful to have fewer, but things that truly kind of mean something to your company. So, while I was at SendGrid, we actually only had 4, and it was super simple and easy to remember. And it's called our 4 H's. And every single person at SendGrid knows them by heart. It's, hungry, honest, humble, and happy. And basically we built that into, even just the day-to-day vocabulary that we use, so that people can say like, hey, you know what, we've tackle this problem. We've spent so many hours figuring this out. Let's lean in to kind of some of our honest age and say like, hey, are we just going down a rat hole with this, right? Maybe we can take a step back, or humble age, I made a mistake here, but I own up to it, and let's fix the problem. So so it kind of builds into that vocabulary in terms of day-to-day how people talk about our culture and how we really live it. And so it's very interwoven feeling into the company versus something that is published and then you never look at again.
Cool. And I want to double click on something you said there, not specifically related to culture, but when you talk about a lot of times companies, they put things out, whether it's their mission, their culture, a priority for the month, the quarter, the year. And sometimes it's like this humongous thing. And if everyone in the company can't recite what that is, then it's worthless. Right? Whether it's your North Star, the metric you're tracking, the whatever it is, I think it's so important to really simplify so that everyone can get behind it. Because if you ask, how many companies you ask, 5 people, what is our culture or a priority for this, and everyone says something different, clearly that's been a failure there at some point, right? So I just wanted to point out that's such an awesome thing, the 4 H's, and you still remember it, right? And that's why that's so awesome. I think a part of culture, and Pooja talked about this before, are you additive or whatnot? And hiring is such a huge part of scaling, right? You need to grow, you need to scale, you need more people to do that. But hiring is challenging as well. So, I mean, Brad, let's kind of start with you. What are some of the tips you have for scaling your hiring processes over, your smaller companies in Marqeta?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is really coming down to what are we concretely looking for? I think we try to scale a hiring process to 300 people or more of interviewers. Everyone has a different calibration of what they're looking for. I think we talk about culture fit in the industry, and I honestly think that's kind of a pretty bad measure. Or people will say, can I have beers with this person? That's also a really bad measure. What I want to do is find someone who can do the job and will up level Marqeta in some way. Are they going to add to the culture? Are they going to be a great teammate, partner? Are they going to be a mentor? Are they going to be really amazing algorithms, whatever? There's going to be some element of up leveling. So I think for Marqeta, where we were about 2 years ago, it was a pretty inconsistent process that everyone had their own kind of pocket questions. And so ultimately it was getting into, let's agree on a common set of interview questions and competencies. What are we truly looking for in our team members? Then trying to build objective measures around that. What does good look like? Can we all agree on that? And then moving forward. I think that, at a much smaller company, it's rare to have that much process, and often it's a network-driven thing. I worked with this person before, or this person is recommended to me. So it's important to figure out what the right stage for that kind of process, because it's pretty heavy-handed interview training and objective criteria, but it is really important for trying to build a really amazing and diverse workforce. If we have a concrete set of objectives that we're all interviewing on, there's less room for bias.
Awesome. And Emelia, how do you, as as you're hiring at some smaller companies, how do you compete? Like, what are some of the things that you use to help drive your hiring process at your company?
Yeah, one of the things we think a lot about is how to have candidates leave our experience, whether it's the right fit or not, feeling like it was a really good experience end to end. And so we think a lot about crafting that experience like we would think about crafting a product. We want to make sure there are checkpoints along the way, making sure that there are breaks throughout the day, just following sort of all the best practices about what feels good from an interview standpoint, and remembering that like this is a person we're interacting with. And interviewing is hard and hiring is hard on both sides. That's one of the things we think about. I think the other part of it for us in terms of competing is to draw on our core values as a company. I think this kind of speaks a lot to what we were talking about a bit before in terms of having a really memorable foundation for prioritization, how you're making decisions, and living those, whether it's values or the 4 H's or whatever it might be. Making sure to speak to those throughout the process. We want to compete with people who, for people who it's going to be a good fit, and making sure that the person that we're speaking to has the framework to really think about how it would be to work within the company. So just continuing to sort of speak to those values and making sure that's consistent and crafting that really good experience.
Awesome. I'm going to remember the 4 H's forever now, Shah. Like, I know it all. Now, as far as hiring too, there's culture, but sometimes there's a big project. You have sales deadlines. You have something. You need to get something out the door for next funding round. Something like that. What has anyone here ever used any outside help? To do that. I certainly have. I know one of our sponsors, Lohika, certainly can kind of help with that as well. But any tips that you would use to sort of say, hey, what are some of the things that it is important to look for when you're trying to maybe get some more resources quickly? Shah, I think you raised your hand.
Yeah, absolutely. We're actually going through that phase right now at Catalyst. We don't have a large engineering team, but we do know that we have a huge revenue target this year, and we're looking to front load a lot of our features, again, to enable our sales team to kind of go after this revenue. And so from that perspective, hiring also takes time, right? Kind of setting up your interview process, getting, sourcing for candidates, getting them into the pipeline, getting them set up also takes time away from development. And so I think, at certain points, when you're trying to kind of really spike and go fast, it's good to be intentional about, kind of balancing that with certain level of staff augmentation from a contracting perspective. And so, I think both from a full-time hiring perspective and from a contracting perspective, I've been working a lot with my engineering managers to kind of really hone in on identifying gaps because there's no unicorn candidates. There's no like, hey, this person is going to hit all these check marks or do everything for this team, right? There's always like, hey, as a team, we're short a couple of people who really have depth and knowledge around scale, or who brings a level of like, for example, right now we use Ruby on Rails as our primary tech stack, who brings that level of Rails knowledge, who can get us to the next level. And so you're looking for kind of what your current team is, what are some of the areas that you have gaps on, and then how go about intentionally finding whether it's full-time staffing or contract staff augmentation that helps you fill those gaps intentionally. And so when we think about contractors, we actually have identified 3 very distinct areas. So one is, we have a bunch of work, and when our teams are focused on huge features, a lot of these quick wins and kind of paper cut releases are not getting done. And a lot of times, our customers, they want to see things coming out on a weekly basis, just like, hey, every week they're fixing something, they're, addressing our P1 bugs, they're getting new features out the door. And so basically we've identified a set of contractors to kind of help us with very like discrete, very like self-contained smaller items that they can work on relatively independently without having, huge understanding of like, what is this problem space? How are all these different pieces working together? But they can just, come in and, be impactful. So we've definitely engaged, contracting from that perspective. We know we need to scale for our next phase of growth. And so there's a couple of very distinct fundamental like infrastructure things that we're doing in terms of looking at our data store, looking at adding a data warehouse solution, looking at our data pipeline as we move from a monolith to more of microservices, architecture. So we're also very intentional about bringing in like, industry experts who have very distinct skills scaling at that level. And they're kind of pairing with our engineers, discussing what we need to do for the next 12 to 18 months to help us, get past the scaling problem. And then, finally, our third bucket is very specific. Like, so we're like, hey, there's a very specific problem we're moving through around kind of our rails and just getting more utilization or getting more performance improvement in a certain area of our code base. And so how do we get, contractors who just specialize in a particular area? And so that's kind of how we've, gone about planning for this integration without having it be a huge, taxing thing to onboard and integrate that many number of people onto our existing team, which is, fairly small right now. So.
Sure. Awesome, Sham. Thank you for that. I kind of want to get to something too and Pooja talked about this before. There tends to be inflection points in companies, right? Companies that have not yet had product market fit, and then those that do have product market fit. Pooja, maybe if you could go a little bit, kind of what changes from an engineering focus, like but when you're pre-market fit and then post-product market fit?
Sure. It's interesting when you're trying to be in the space of searching for product market fit, you're going to try things a lot, right? Hopefully you're not completely trying some, different things. And I've been in those companies as well that have not been successful. But if you imagine like a Gartner quadrant, right? In that space, you're going to try a bunch of things, which means what you want is folks who can build things that validate a strong signal and are okay to let go of them if it didn't work, right? So I think like that's a different mentality and a muscle, because I've seen also people get so caught in the fact that so much effort was made, and if there's not enough equal impact, they're not able to let go of it. So I feel like when you're trying to search for product market fit, that's the energy you need, is I'm going to try 10 things in this space, and the horse that's going to win is the one that we're going to go after in a much more meaningful manner. Once you've figured that product market fit, then I think then the problems are entirely different, right? Is that then you're starting to think about scaling, then you're starting to think about things like building availability, resilience. Like in that area, you now start investing in things differently. You still need feature growth because you still want to make sure that your customers are hungry. Shah, I'm going to keep, I love those 4 H's. So we want your customers to be hungry for new, right? But then their expectation is also that whatever they're using is highly performant, resilient, available, their data is secure, right? So like those investments just become different. And at that stage, I usually, this is the way I'm trying to get our engineering teams, that is that figure out what your budget is for technology investments. This is not tech debt, this is tech investment, right? And like rethink that and work with the business to always have that budget, right? Because I think like what's easy to sort of like let go of that budget in terms of, well, it's debt that we can pay off later, or, it's just, it will always get robbed by features, right? So like as being an engineering leader, you just have to negotiate that. And I think like really good companies do that as like 60 to 40, like, somewhere in that 60-40 being 60 being feature growth, 40 being tech investment. But the framing of it not just being tech debt and keeping the lights on, actually investing for the future, for future leverage.
Yeah, that's so awesome. I could talk all about that, about reframing tech debt to maybe tech risk and investment, and that makes a huge, huge difference. We can have a whole nother conversation about that. I'd love to talk about that. There is an audience question I want to get to that I think is a good one. There's a few, but I think one is interesting too, especially as eng leaders. Let me read this off. It's from, let's see, Humaraya, I believe. What skills would you look for in engineers where you would consider them for joining the engineering leadership teams as the company grows and scales, or would you look to external candidates first? So let's say, anyone want to answer that one off the cuff? I think it's such an awesome one, and then we'll go to the chat after this. But Shah, you want to kind of jump on that one?
Yeah, so I think, as I think about like, especially earlier stage startup, I like to, and knowing that, right now we just don't have the capacity or the, number of people to really introduce a lot of processes. And I think, initially I definitely look for engineers who can operate based on, a North Star, and people who kind of, what I call like can deal with grace, right? Like not just black and white, like how is this thing defined, but understanding the context behind what we're trying to build and understanding the why, so that you can have that level of flexibility to say, okay, I know the objective, I know the goal of what we're trying to optimize for, whether it's, we're trying to, get to this number from a page performance perspective, or we're trying to increase our customer usage by this much, right? So once I know where that kind of goal is, then I can basically have different levers that I can pull to get there. And whether that's, kind of to Pooja's point, like experimenting with different things and really creating that kind of room for experimentation, or being able to say, I tried something, it didn't work, and let me pivot to something else, right? And so like knowing kind of ultimately where the company is trying to go and be able to align like engineering objectives to that, and being able to like try different things to kind of accomplish those things. I think those are the qualities that I look a lot for in like my leadership team, as well as the more senior individual contributors.
Awesome, Brad. And one quick thing, what do you think at Marqeta? Do you have sort of, what do you prefer? Is it internal leveling up? Is it external? Like, what have you done as Marqeta's grown?
Yeah, I think I always prefer internal. I prefer folks who are really hungry. They want to learn. They want to be mentored. So we do make sure that we've got folks aligned with a good mentor to help them out. But also, do we have room for them in the organization? Is there a good place for them to be nurtured and to grow and to try that manager path?
Awesome. Well, that sort of is the time for our live session today. I do want to thank all of you. It's been awesome. I could chat and jam about this all day. I love talking about engineering challenges with awesome other engineering leaders like yourself. We're going to be taking questions now on the Lead Dev Slack in the hashtag scaling channel. If you want to head there to continue the discussion. Thank you for Lead Dev and Lohika for sponsoring this section. Lead Dev, I always have to give them a shout out. Amazing. Hopefully one day we'll be back in person, because they're the most awesome conferences I've ever been to. And if you want to speak at them, they treat you so well for first-time speakers too. So awesome about diversity and inclusion, and making sure that that's such a safe space for everybody too. So again, thank you, panelists. Again, we'll be going over to the scaling channel, and we'll see you there. But thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you all.